All right. Good morning. My name is Sarah Newberg. I'm one of the Lifelong Learning Volunteer MCs. As you know, the Lifelong Learning program is new this year. It's geared for all of our adult parishioners and encompasses a broad spectrum of relevant issues and the Catholic response to them. We have been blessed with 2 Carmelite speakers that will be rotating each month, Brother Jonathan and Brother Joseph Teresa, along with several accomplished guest speakers. Without further ado, I would like to introduce to you our speaker for this morning's topic, Dr. Marianne Urlakis. Dr. Urlakis is a Catholic bioethicist, the co-founder and president of the Dignitas Personae Institute of Nascent Human Life, and a St. Mary's parishioner. She will talk about the sanctity of embryonic human life and the ethical issues surrounding IVF. Please help me welcome her with a warm round of applause.
Thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Sarah, for the welcome, and Wendy for the invitation, Father Jude for the invitation. Let's see, there we go. All right, let's begin, as I always do, with a prayer. This is a prayer that I wrote for one of the radio programs that I do. Dear God, our Heavenly Creator, you are the author of life and of truth, the reality that you will each and every human person into being, created from the moment of conception, bearing the dignity and imprint of your own image and likeness. The very essence of our being is a mystery beyond human understanding. Please help us to have a greater appreciation for the gift of being created in your image and likeness. Help us to reverence that reality in our brothers and sisters, especially in the tiniest and most vulnerable among them. Help us to defend the sanctity of every human life from conception to natural death. And we ask of our ever immaculate, Blessed Virgin Mary, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. A little bit about me. I'm a bioethicist. I was the first graduate of the Medical College of Wisconsin's program a long time ago. And I'm a perpetual student. I have a couple masters in ethics and a PhD, and I'm currently a student at Pontifex University pursuing a third master's and a second PhD in theology. My most cherished role is wife and mother, and I've been married for 30 years. I'm the mother of 8 children, 5 the old-fashioned way, 3, whoops, you can't hear me? Okay, perfect. Thank you. So, been married for 30 years. I'm a mom of 8 living children, 5 of them the old-fashioned way, 3 are adopted, 1 from Ethiopia and 2 from Guatemala. And I also have 2 little ones who died during pregnancy that I know are there in heaven waiting for me. For this morning's presentation, I like to have a timeline, so you know I'm not wandering through the lilies. There's a method to the whole thing. We prayed. I'm going to define bioethics for you. We're going to talk a little bit about the anthropology of the human person. What is a human person? From there, we're going to go into IVF. What is in vitro fertilization? And what does the church say about it? Then we're going to explore some of the ethical issues. From there, I'm hoping to have some time for your questions, and then we'll end with prayer as well. Whoops, I went too far ahead. All right, sorry. What is bioethics? At its core, bioethics can be defined as a field of study which engages in the work of philosophy, law, medicine, politics, technology, and it's that nexus where we grapple with the problems at the edges of life. As technology continues to race ahead of man's ability to comprehend the scope of its unintended consequences, at the very fundamental core of bioethics is a respect for human persons. The study of bioethics involves this interplay between what is theoretical and what is practical. The theoretical dimension is often the battleground of the academics. The practical and what's happening at the bedside is also very important. And when these become divorced from their theological underpinnings, we have problems. Before 1927, the field of bioethics did not exist. And yet, in a century, look at where it has come. How often do you hear, well, let's ask the bioethicists, let's ask the experts? In some ways, this particular discipline has been given a weight and a credibility that is probably not necessarily legitimate. You ask 3 bioethicists the same question, you ask 3 Catholic bioethicists the same question, and you may get 3 very different answers. But that's why we have the magisterium, and the magisterium points us to the truth. Secular bioethics and theory questions the technology, the questions that are most prevalent in bioethics are the questions at the edges of life, the questions at the very beginning of life, the questions that deal with the end of life. Those are the most poignant questions, and that's really where we run into the need for guidance most often. Without its theological underpinnings and philosophical underpinnings, bioethics becomes simply a relativistic approach to doing things. Truth is not an academic concept. Truth is a person. Truth is Jesus Christ. And he is the way, the truth, and the life. And in everything that I do as a Catholic bioethicist, everything comes back to Christ. Everything comes back to the church. Respect for human persons is at the very core of everything we do in bioethics. This is one of my favorite quotes from Pope St. John Paul the Great. For man, the right to life is the fundamental right, and yet a part of contemporary culture has wanted to deny that right, turning it into an uncomfortable right, one that has to be defended. But there is no other right that so closely affects the very existence of the person. The right to life means the right to be born, and the right to continue to live until one's natural end. As long as I live, I have the right to live. The desire for God, this comes from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the very beginning. The desire for God is written on the human heart because man is created by God and for God. We find our fulfillment in God, and we are destined to be ever searching for him in this world so that we can be happy with him in the next. The dignity of man rests in the fact that he is created in the image and the likeness of God. From Evangelium Vitae, from Pope St. John Paul, man's life comes from God. It is his gift, his image, his imprint, a sharing in his breath of life. God, therefore, is the sole Lord of the life. Man cannot do with it as he wills. God himself makes this clear to Noah after the flood. For your own lifeblood, too, I will demand an accounting. And from man, in regard to his fellow man, I demand an accounting for human life. Genesis 9:5. The biblical text is concerned to emphasize how the sacredness of life has its foundation in God and his creative activity. For God made man in his own image. Endowed with a spiritual and immortal soul, the human person is the only creature on earth that God willed for its own sake. From its conception, he intended it and destined it for eternal beatitude. Human life is sacred. The divine image is present in man, and it shines forth in the communion of persons, the likeness and the union of the divine persons among ourselves. Christ is the very revelation of the mystery of the Father and of his love, and he makes man fully manifest to himself and brings light to light his exalted vocation. It is in Christ that the image of the invisible God, that man has been created in the image and likeness of the Creator. It is in Christ, Redeemer and Savior, that the divine image, which is disfigured by our sins, by man, by the first sin, has been restored to its original beauty and ennobled by God. Every person has a dignity by virtue of being created in the image and likeness of God. I love that concept. I wrote in the foreword of one of the books that I have here that we talk about being created in the Imago Dei, in the image and likeness of God. The two are separate things. The image of God means that we bear the imprint of his being from our first moment of existence. The likeness of God means that we have the capacity to become like him with our free choices, with the graces that we are given. The image and likeness of God. The early church fathers wrote much about this, and unfortunately we don't hear much about it today, which I personally think is evident in our society. If we understood more the dignity that we have, having that image and likeness of God present within us, the beauty, the dignity, the irrevocable call to become like him, I think that we would treasure that image and likeness more, and we would respect ourselves and others more. Human life is sacred. We are made in the image and likeness of God. We have an incomparable dignity and worth. We are created by love, for love. We have an eternal destiny to love. And we need to choose to act in accordance with that destiny and the dignity that we have. The human person is the summit of God's creation. It is in the human person that the glory of God shines forth as a reflection of his handiwork, sharing the image and likeness of the Blessed Trinity by a unified movement of grace. Human life is sacred. The reading that we had this morning for the gospel, from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. And for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. It is a great mystery, but everything flows from this. Therefore, what God has joined together, man must not separate. And that includes as we look at these artificial reproductive technologies, what God has joined together in the sacrament of marriage ought not be separated into constituent parts and placed in a laboratory. In Donum Vitae, two of the documents that I'll be quoting back and forth are Donum Vitae and Dignitas Personae. Donum Vitae came first. Donum Vitae was written by Pope Benedict when he was Cardinal Ratzinger in February 1987. And it was the gift of life. It was one of the first heavy-duty Vatican documents that dealt with the technology and what is licit and what is illicit. And it all goes back to the dignity of the human person, the anthropology of the human person. Thanks to the progress of biological and medical sciences, man has at his disposal ever more effective therapeutic resources. But he can also acquire new powers with unforeseen consequences over human life at its very beginning and its first stages. Various procedures now make it possible to intervene, not only in order to assist, but to dominate the process of procreation. These techniques enable man to take in hand his own destiny, but they expose him to the temptation to go beyond the limits of reasonable dominion over his nature. What are the stats? Between 1987 and 2015, 1 million babies have been born in the U.S. via IVF, per a report by the Society of Assisted Reproductive Technology. It's interesting. There is no mandatory reporting. The industry
of IVF, the industry of artificial reproductive technologies, is not particularly regulated. And all of the reporting is voluntary. So when we hear statistics about, well, there's this success rate and there's that success rate, what plays into quote unquote success? There is no transparency. So there are about 450 IVF clinics in the United States, IVF clinical laboratories in the United States, and about 90% of them are part of the Society of Assisted Reproductive Technology. But what they choose to report and what they choose not to report is a mystery. In vitro fertilization, the creation of human embryos in the laboratory. It involves the harvesting of ova from women and sperm from men, the fertilization of the ova by the sperm in a laboratory setting, usually in a dish, and the grading of optimal embryos, and the transfer of those embryos that are selected back into a woman's body. So what we have first is this process of stimulating a woman's ovaries to create more ova. And it is an expensive and painful process. Women who choose to embark on this route end up giving themselves daily injections. They take powerful hormones to cause their ovaries to be hyperstimulated to release more ova, to release more eggs. And then with the help of anesthesia, the eggs are retrieved from the woman. Man's sperm is collected, and then there's two processes. One is a co-incubation process where about 700,000 sperm to one ova are introduced in a glass or in a dish, in a petri dish. And the other is intracytoplasmic sperm injection, where one single sperm is injected into the cytoplasm of one single ova. Then some of the embryos, after being graded, are transferred back into the woman. This is the introcytoplasmic sperm injection, the injection of one single sperm into one human ova to create one human person. One human person. We have the zygote there at the beginning, and this shows you the different stages that the zygote is going through as it is dividing. There's quality control. The embryos are graded, and as they progress to the state of being blastocysts and morulas, they're also regraded. So in the first picture, the embryo grading, they are nice, tight cells, so that would be a high grade. In the second picture, the cell membranes are busted on some of them. That would be a lower grade. There's all sorts of ways of grading, and every IVF laboratory has its own rubric for grading. So this becomes an ethical issue when we are looking at grading human persons based on their categories. We are not looking at them as a child made in the image and likeness of God. We're grading them on the quality of their cytoplasm and the quality of their cell membranes. It doesn't seem to want to advance. Good, okay. Thank you. In addition to the grading that takes place, there is also PGT, pre-implantation genetic testing, sometimes called PGS, pre-implantation genetic screening, and PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And what happens here is that at a certain stage, usually at about 8 cells, a single cell is removed from the embryo, and that cell is sent for biopsy. And there's various things that can be detected by biopsying the embryo. Gender, if there's any chromosomal abnormalities, Downs, other chromosomal abnormalities. There are certain genetic footprints that have a certain characteristic, a certain picture. They can't say for sure whether one will have a certain genetic disease, but it fits a picture, it fits a rubric. So again, we're engaging in picking and choosing which human beings live and which ones don't based on their physical features, their physical qualities from the time they are merely a few cells. This is the process. So cells are taken from an early stage embryo. They are amplified by PCR technique, which I'm sure you folks have all heard of PCR in this past year and a half, and you know how reliable PCR is. So cell DNA is amplified millions of times. Tests determine whether an embryo shares a genetic footprint that may mean that that embryo may have a certain disease, and faulty chromosomes are also identified. If embryos are determined to be problematic, they are destroyed, they're killed. Human persons are killed. If they are determined to be okay, they may be implanted. I have a good friend who used to work in the insurance industry for IVF before her conversion. And she had told me early on that it was in the best interests of the insurance companies to make sure that there was a healthy single baby. Because a healthy single baby costs less in terms of ICU stay and time in the hospital. So it made more sense to create more embryos at the beginning end, 25, 30, so that we could get the perfect embryo for implantation. So in that sense, you know, for every one that may be implanted, you may have 25 other human persons that have been created in a laboratory that are going to be discarded. This is a new technique. This also raises ethical issues as well. In this technique, this is InvaCell. Because of the issues with swapped cultures in incubators, where one thought they were getting, the technician may have swapped cultures in a tray, and somebody may end up with the wrong embryo implanted and they don't know it. So there's an issue there. And it was discovered that, lo and behold, the woman's body is the best place to incubate embryos rather than an incubator. So in this instance, this InvaCell device, the sperm and the egg, rather than being introduced in a laboratory dish, are introduced in this teeny little time capsule. And the capsule is placed back inside the woman for 7 days, so that the sperm and the eggs will meet and new embryos will be created. And then the woman is induced to expel the capsule so that they can go through the process of grading the embryos and deciding which one gets put back in. So in essence, a woman may be carrying 15 of her children, and then they are aborted, they are taken out, and the best one is put back in. This raises huge ethical issues. How much does IVF cost? It's a business. And a lot of folks don't see it as a business at the beginning. The average cost for one single cycle in the United States is about $12,000. Sometimes it's more expensive than that. The cost of intracytoplasmic sperm injection is about $2,000 for each one. The cost of the genetic testing runs between $3,000 and $7,500. The average cost of a frozen embryo transfer is between $3,000 and $5,000. If one chooses to use donor eggs, you're talking about $25,000 to $30,000 per cycle. And the yearly cost of keeping your embryos frozen is in the ballpark of about $500. According to GoodRx, the cost of IVF medications, which are generally not covered by insurance, has increased 50% since 2014. And the typical cost for the 3 medications that one needs when they are in the process is about $2,700 a month. The global IVF market is very lucrative. In 2020, it was a $14.2 billion a year business. The market value in 2021 had grown to $21.8 billion. And it is projected that by 2028, it will be a $34 billion a year business. The global IVF service market, this is the market that services the IVF laboratories. This is the market that provides the culture media, the equipment, and the dishes and the plasticware. That market alone has been growing at a rate of 9.3% and was a $25 million market. This is the growth of the market that is just the laboratory ware for IVF, the culture media, the disposable devices, and the capital equipment. IVF is a business, and it's viewed as a business. Looking at the regions of the world where one can expect the most growth, the Asian region is the largest growing sector, but North America is not far behind. So what happens to the leftover embryos? Some are frozen indefinitely, some are destroyed, some are donated to another couple, and others are donated to science. I say donated to science because can you really donate another human person to be sacrificed? There are many issues with the freezing, with the cryopreservation, and in some countries cryopreservation has been outlawed. The early cryopreservation techniques caused a lot of ice crystals. So now there are certain additives, including polyethylene glycol, that are used in a vitrification process. So the embryos are vitrified before they're frozen, which has reduced the ice crystallization. What does the church say? Donum vitae, the freezing of embryos, even when carried out in order to preserve the life of an embryo, cryopreservation constitutes an offense against the respect due to human beings by exposing them to the grave risks of death or harm to their physical integrity and depriving them, at least temporarily, of maternal shelter and gestation, thus placing them in a situation which further offenses and manipulation are possible. No one knows how many embryos are lost or destroyed each year. As I mentioned earlier, there is only one agency that takes voluntary reporting. So we have really no idea how many embryos are being frozen and how many are being destroyed. A couple years back, there was a huge issue with 2 freezers that went down, one in California and one in Cleveland. And there was about 1,000 embryos in one instance, and I think about 2,000 in the other, that were lost when the freezer failed. And the attorneys have jumped in and see the need that there are individuals whose rights ought to be protected in the event that the fertility center preservation devices, the freezers, fail. There was a study in Great Britain in 2012 which indicated that 1.7 million embryos that had been created for IVF had been thrown away, that only about 7% lead to pregnancy. So 93% of the embryos that are created worldwide are destroyed. We think that there are about 1 million babies that have been born in the US between 1987 and 2017. If that only represents 7% and 93% were created and destroyed, when you think about the numbers of embryos that are killed in this industry, it's staggering. It really is. More than 1.7 million embryos prepared with the aim of helping women become pregnant have been thrown away since the records began in Britain 21 years ago. More than 3.5 million embryos had been created in just Great Britain. As a result, 93% of the embryos created, more than 3.3 million, were never used to generate a pregnancy. Of the embryos created, 839,325 were put in storage for future use. 2,071 were stored for donation to other families, and 5,876 were set aside for scientific research, which we'll get into in just a little bit. Donum vitae, the connection between in vitro fertilization and the voluntary destruction of human embryos occurs too often. This is significant. Through these procedures, with apparently contrary purposes, life and death are subjected to the decision of man, who sets himself up as the giver and the taker of life, of death by decree. Again, donum vitae. Certain attempts to influence chromosomic or genetic inheritance are not therapeutic, but are aimed at producing human beings selected according to sex or other predetermined qualities, just like what we were talking about with the grading system and the biopsies. These manipulations are contrary to the personal dignity of the human being, his or her integrity and identity. Therefore, in no way can they be justified on the grounds of a possible beneficial consequence for future humanity. Every person must be respected for himself. This consists the dignity and the right of every human being from his or her beginning. Donum vitae also on surrogacy. Surrogate motherhood represents an objective failure to meet the obligations of maternal love, of conjugal fidelity, and of responsible motherhood. It defends the dignity and the right of the child to be conceived, carried in the womb and brought into the world and brought up by his own parents. It sets up, to the detriment of families, a division between the physical and psychological and moral elements that constitute those families. The dignity of a person must be recognized in every human being from conception to natural death. This fundamental principle expresses a great yes to human life and must be the center of ethical reflection on biomedical research, which has an ever greater importance in today's world. The Church's magisterium has frequently intervened to clarify and resolve the moral questions in this area. The instruction, Donum Vitae, was particularly significant, and now 20 years after its publication, it was brought up to date with Dignitas Personae. The oldest baby on record that has been frozen was born to a 28-year-old mother last year. The baby had been frozen for 28 years, and the mom was 29. And the baby's sister had been frozen for 24 years. We end up with some interesting relationships when you have a child that has been on the face of the earth as long as the woman who is now carrying it. I've had the privilege of interviewing this young lady who is now 21 years old. She was the first embryo to be adopted. And this is a book that was written by her father, John Sturgey. Her mom and President Bush are on the back cover of the book. She and her 10 siblings were frozen in liquid nitrogen. Hannah's adoptive mom had also gone through IVF unsuccessfully, and they asked for the possibility of adopting the embryos from another family. So they went through a full adoption process, a home study, everything that would go with an adoption process. And Hannah and her 10 siblings were thawed, and 9 of the embryos self-arrested. They didn't make it through the process of thawing, and Hannah was the only one that did. And Hannah met with President Bush in the Oval Office. She was instrumental. Remember years ago when there was a moratorium placed on research on embryos. It was Hannah's visit to President Bush at the time that showed him the humanity of the embryo and just that these embryos that are stored in liquid nitrogen are really human persons. They're just being deprived and being held in suspension. There is good and evil here. And as much as we're told it's all relative, it's not. There are real choices to be made, and there is real good and evil. As we look at some of the ethical issues, this is a new one that's emerging. Louisville doctor used his own sperm to inseminate women. His patients didn't know that. The individual that discovered this and went on Louisville TV, it's a 49-year-old woman who, thanks to 23andMe and Ancestry.com, we've got a lot of folks who are doing genetic testing and trying to find what they know about their family history. And what they're getting back, some of them, are that they were conceived in IVF, and this woman has 7 siblings that she didn't know she had, and she found out about it on Facebook. And all 7 siblings had the same dad, and the same dad was the fertility doctor who had lied to her parents. And it wasn't illegal at the time, and in some states it's not illegal now. This isn't an isolated incident. This happened in Michigan recently. This doctor, who's now 104, has over 1,000 children. He was substituting his own sperm and claims that most of the doctors that he was practicing with were doing the same thing. He was practicing in an exclusively Jewish area, a small segment of society that has a very definite genetic disposition. So now you have the issue of some of these children who have married, who have children that have gone off to college, that are intermarrying, and they have no idea whether they are marrying their first cousin, whether they, all of these issues. Yes? It was success. He didn't have another, what he thought was a viable sample available at the time, so he chose to use his own. And this is unfortunately happening all over the world. In the US, in just the past 2 years, we've had one in Indiana, one in Texas, one in California. There's one in Great Britain. There's one, a Dutch, I think 600 for the one Netherlands. This is a practice that, as egregious as it is, has happened all over the place. The young woman who, from Louisville, as I listened to her tape, she was saying how difficult it was, her mom was saying how difficult it was for her to have found this out on Facebook, and to have everything that she had ever believed about herself to suddenly come crashing down. One of the other major ethical issues deals with the embryos and research. We used to have a moratorium on how long embryos who were created for research could be kept alive. Now, we've talked about the embryos that are being, quote unquote, donated. I haven't mentioned that there are embryos that are being created in laboratories every single day that are only being created for research. And we don't know what those numbers are. And until recently, there was a line in the sand that they could only be kept alive for 2 weeks, and then they had to be killed. And in recent months, that's changed. The international ban has been lifted, and so now we can experiment on embryos a lot longer. There hasn't been a new line in the sand determined. We've had the race to gene editing, to use CRISPR technology to edit the genome of embryos. First US team to gene edit, that was July 2017. There's gene editing that is being done for profit in the IVF laboratories, where you end up with a embryo that has 3 genetic parents or more. And then there's gene editing that's being done for the sake of research. This is He Zhangqi, and he created an international stir about a year ago when he created a set of twins, Nana and Lulu, who he genetically altered their genome using CRISPR technology and IVF, altering the CCR5 gene. The CCR5 gene has an increased, those who carry the CCR5 gene have an increased susceptibility to HIV. So he claimed that he was doing this to be a good citizen and trying to create children who would not be susceptible to HIV. It also, those who do not, it also alters their lifespan. And there's some interesting stuff coming out now about the possibility of it increasing their intelligence. So no one really knows what his motive was. I have a feeling that if he had been welcomed with applause, it would have passed through the radar of a whole bunch of folks. But because there was an international outcry, he ended up going to jail. But there's a whole lot of folks doing exactly the same thing he was doing. These are the twins, designer babies. Donum vitae. Techniques of fertilization in vitro can open up the way to other forms of biological and genetic manipulation of human embryos, such as attempts or plans for fertilization between human and animal gametes and the gestation of human embryos in the uterus of animals, or the hypothesis or projection of artificial uteruses for the human embryo. These procedures are contrary to the human dignity proper to the embryo, and at the same time, they are contrary to the right of every person to be conceived and born within marriage and from marriage. And that's from Pope Benedict as Cardinal Ratzinger in Donum Vitae back in February of 1987. And he was so insightful. What he predicted to happen is happening. How many of you folks have heard the word chimera before? Okay. Ivana. Chimeras are really interesting. When you think about a hybrid of an animal, think about like a donkey and a horse, you end up with a mule. And in a mule, every cell is a mule cell. Every cell is a hybrid cell. It was explained to me years ago with a analogy with clay and Lego blocks. So I'm using the same technique here for you folks. With a hybrid, your mule being created from a donkey and a horse. You've got your red clay and your white clay, and you mix it all together and squish it all together, and it is indistinguishable. You end up with pink clay. You end up with something that is neither one or the other and cannot reproduce. With a chimera, it's a completely different situation, especially the chimeras that are being created in the laboratory. This is a glebe. A geep or glebe is part goat, part sheep. And what's done is the nucleus of one embryo is removed and the nucleus of another is exchanged from sheep to goat. And certain cells are substituted in a specific order, or CRISPR technology is applied. And you end up with two species that, if you were to biopsy the part on the glebe that looks like goat, it would come back that this animal is 100% goat. If you biopsy the part on the geep that looks like a sheep, it would come back that this animal is 100% sheep. So instead of it being clay that's mixed, it's more like Lego blocks. And there has been a race to do this with humans since the 1980s. In the 1980s, we had our first effort at a part human, part sheep from the University of Nevada. It was a researcher from Iran, I believe. And that animal was 15% human. We've now moved into the pig-human experiments, and there are part pig, part humans that are being incubated, and these experiments have been going on since 2016 and before. For a while, there was a moratorium on federal funding for any of these, and it didn't matter because you've got private resources that are more than willing to do it. Stanford was able to recruit the scientists with the help of a $6 million grant from the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine. So all of these questions, what happens if an embryo develops that's mostly human? Well, he says it's something we can't rule out. It's not something we're expecting, but we'll have to deal with that if we get there. So all of these ethical questions emerge. If you are moving into the realm of part human, part pig, part human, part sheep, if it is an animal that's 15% human, is that considered human? If it's 25% human, if it's 40% human, if it's 50% human, does it matter if it is human heart or human brain? Where does it become a human person? This is a pig-human chimera embryo. This pig was injected with human cells early in its development so that it would grow a human pancreas. So the pig embryo is growing a human pancreas. And in that photo over there, you have the individual cells that are being introduced into the pig embryo. And now that we have changed the limit on the 14-day rule, these animals can be grown. So the way they sell this is creating organs for transplant. So human cells are introduced into a pig, a porcine embryo, grown in pigs, as you see in the top photo. And the idea is they will be able to grow human organs, human hearts, human lungs, human pancreas, and they will not be rejected because they have the human, because 25% of their makeup, whatever, is going to be human. Pluripotent stem cells injected into an embryo. The embryo is transplanted into the uterus to produce a human pancreas. The human pancreas would, in theory, be transplanted at some point. And then it brings us back to the baby. You know, we look at all of these wild things that are happening and the dignity of the human person. It really takes your breath away. Human life is sacred. The Church reminds us that the ethical value of biomedical science is gauged in reference both to the unconditional respect owed to every human being at the moment of the first moment of his or her existence, and the defense of the specific character of the personal acts which transmit life. The two dimensions of life, the natural and the supernatural, allow us to understand better the sense in which the acts that permit a new human being to come into existence, in which man and woman give themselves to each other, are a reflection of the Trinitarian love. God, who is love and life, has inscribed in man and woman the vocation to share in a very special way in his mystery of personal communion and his work as Creator and Father. This is one of my favorites. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today. I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. So choose life in order that you and your children may live. Whoops, I don't have my other slides on here. Do I? Is that the last one? It is. Oh, I must not have saved the other ones. One of the organizations that I work with, I'm on the board of, is Sacred Heart Guardians and Shelter. And what we do is we bury the embryos that die in IVF laboratories. One of my dear friends, Laura Elm, is the president and the founder of Sacred Heart Guardians and Shelter. She was the individual that had been working in the insurance industry before her conversion. And now she cold calls all 450 clinics on a frequent basis and asks them for their embryos that would be discarded as medical waste. And we bury them in a Catholic cemetery. They are treated with dignity and respect. And to date, I think we have buried about 568 embryos, and it is just a tiny, tiny, tiny portion of what's out there. But it is giving these tiny little persons the dignity and the respect that they deserve. And with that, if you have any questions, yes.
My friend's got some IVF papers with the doctor and got some health reports to fill out, and they want to know what is your sex, and then later it says what is your gender. What is the difference?
It's the same thing. You know, right now there is a lot of confusion about gender and about sex. Your chromosomes tell you exactly what you have, and that's not something that can be changed, even if folks wish to change it. When I talk about being made in the image and likeness of God and being a part of the covenant that we have, that covenantal relationship that we have with God, it is not for us to opt out of that covenantal relationship. Whether we like it or not, we're made in the imprint and the image and likeness of God, male and female from the beginning. Some people may be confused, some people may not like that, but it is what is. Good question, thank you. Yes?
I can comment because I work at a medical office. If the sex is your package, it's fine. It's what you were born. Gender is what you think you are. And we've gotten so smart, we've gotten stupid because we separated the two. And I've had a great deal of folks who've been offended by it. What do you mean? What's my gender? Isn't it evident? But it's where we're living right now, unfortunately.
Good question, yes?
Well, I just expanded on that. I've seen forms that ask what is your birth sex, what is your parents' sex. So I get, but what I do have a question. When you store talking about these 24 months of
It is. It is, and that's one of the big issues, you know. And that was in Dignitas Personae, when the document, the magisterial document, says it is, you know, just it is absolutely illicit to cryopreserve and freeze human embryos. These children deserve more. They deserve to be born. I've described this as the ultimate Good Samaritan situation, where you have when our Lord has said, feed the naked, clothe the hungry, take care of those who are unloved. These frozen embryos are all of that. They are. Now, what's the right answer? I don't know. I was one of the co-founders of the Donum Vitae Institute several years ago. It began with some really, really good work. Some of the folks who are involved in the Institute are at the forefront of embryo adoption. And the church has not ruled, the magisterium has not ruled on whether embryo adoption is licit or illicit. There are really good arguments on both sides. I backed away from the Donum Vitae Institute because I felt that it was the cart before the horse. I felt that the individuals that were involved, as good as they were speaking for the magisterium when the magisterium had yet to speak. So I founded my own institute. There are good reasons for embryo adoption, but there's also a lot of ethical entanglement that comes with it. One of the issues for me is that anytime one is involved with the IVF industry, any money that is being paid to the IVF industry is going right back to create more embryos, for research, and that strikes me as a problem. There are no good answers. You know, some of the folks have said, well, we should just thaw them all. Well, that's not a good answer. You know, if they are currently alive in liquid nitrogen, we can't just go thaw them all. That's not the right answer. These are human persons. When I try to convey to others the personhood of the embryo, when we think about being made in the image and likeness of God, we also have that, we think about who our church celebrates. We celebrate 3 conceptions. We celebrate the conception of our Lord, we celebrate the conception of Our Lady, and we celebrate the conception of John the Baptist. And we believe by dogma that Our Lady was created by a singular grace and privilege, free from original sin. It wasn't her body that was created free from original sin. It was her whole person, soul and body. Soul and body existed together from the first instant of her creation. She was a person. The other thing that I stress is that life cannot come from death. And if you have a body that is soulless, it's a corpse. So it would not be possible that we have at what point would a corpse, a soulless body, become a human person? It is from the first instant of conception, which is what the ancient church always taught. Looking back at the patristics, looking back at St. Irenaeus, looking back at the Didache, St. Justin Martyr, it was taught from the first century that from the very first moment, soul and body were there. Even when we can't see body, even when we're talking 1 cell, 2 cells, soul and body were there, and it was a person from the very first instant. It's our modern technology that's messed this up in some ways. Well, if I can't see it, I can't put a soul under a microscope and see it, so how do I know it's there? You have faith and you believe it's there. Yes. That's a great question. Then that's one I hope that God will explain sometime for me. I don't know. I know. It is the ultimate cruelty to think about these children in liquid nitrogen for 20, 25 years. And it is. It is just, and yet I have compassion for the families who have gone this route too.
many of them had no idea what they were getting into. They were desperate. They had not heard from anyone that this was wrong. We've had so many folks come to us with the Sacred Heart Guardians in shelter with prayer requests. Some of them very, very poignant. Please pray that someday my little one will forgive me for what I've done. And can you bury my thought embryos? So I do have tremendous compassion, and my heart goes out to the folks who have been in this situation. And I think we as a church have to welcome those who have struggled with fertility and have made choices that they may not have been informed of all of the consequences. This is not something that folks are told. Those who are being pushed at times into donating to science are told a greater good can come from your donation. Don't you want to work on creating organs for people in need? They're given this is the great possibility that could be there. They're not told your embryo is going to be combined with a pig or a sheep.
Which raises the other question, right? Where's the soul? In a combined, how can there be a soul if it's a pig and a human being?
That's a question for God.
Are they different? Are they normal? I was told that they have very, I'm asking this question because my granddaughter was born without any women's reproductive.
Okay.
And she was thinking of having, but she was kind of talked out of it. Do these kids have an infiltration? Why did they get
Some of them do. The ones that have been frozen statistically have problems with metabolic syndrome and weight. I don't know why, but those that have been frozen for a long period of time, there are some more genetic disorders. There have been issues with cancer. It hasn't been studied that well, and frankly, those who are studying it are also part of the industry, and they're not going to let the research get out. But there have been those who have done the research, and some of the studies that have gotten out have demonstrated that there are some problems. And I'm running over time, aren't I?
No, that's okay, but I think maybe just one more question.
What's going on behind the scenes? Part of the super soldiers and all that stuff.
Oh, exactly.
Genetics and genes, and that's got to be.
When I looked at, it hit me last night when I looked at what Jin He had done in China, and taking a look at what he was doing with the twins and trying to make them not susceptible to HIV. Well, what else looks like HIV right now? It looks exactly the same. If you're looking at the coding, I would be really curious as to whether they were trying to create those who would not be susceptible to COVID. I don't know. It's just my speculation, but right time frame, 2018, it gets very interesting what else is happening out there. Thank you.
All right, I'd like to thank Dr. Alakis for taking her time to educate us on the multitude of ethical issues surrounding IVF. She said she'd be available if you have any more questions after this. My background's in medicine, and I have to say they do not teach this side of it. So thank you for taking your time to do that. You'll also find a free brochure on the back table by the double doors with information surrounding IVF. Next to the brochure, please note the schedule for our future presentations hosted by St. Mary of the Hill. There's a total of 14 sessions. Please be sure to put them in your calendar. You won't want to miss them. If you enjoyed Dr. Marianne Arlakis' presentation today, please consider donating so that we can continue presentations with such high caliber speakers. Although worth noting, Dr. Arlakis, out of her generosity, has refused payment and has completely donated her time and expertise to us. You already did it, no takesies, backsies. So please join me in thanking her with a round of applause.